Welcome to the HTML5 project training series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial, this is 3D Transforms Part 7, we'll actually be building a 3D selection cube. So similar to what we had done in the last exercise, the last tutorial where we actually built an animated 3D cube, this time we're actually going to get a little bit deeper. We're actually going to build a 3D cube that allows you to actually select the side that's displayed to give you maximum utilization of real estate on an HTML page, and you'll see what I mean as we go through it. So, in part 7 of our tutorial series, we'll continue our journey in the transforms that are available in CSS3 and build a 3D cube that allows the user to select the side of the cube that's actually going to be displayed in the HTML page. And as that side is selected, it actually animates to the side selected inside the browser window. Very, very cool feature that up until CSS3 we weren't able to do that. Now, without using a whole bunch of other external applications to actually get to that point. So let's move into our development environment and demonstrate what we've been discussing in the presentation. All right, so let me go ahead and minimize our presentation, drop down into our development environment. First thing I'm gonna do is I wanna go ahead and make sure that my Apache server is up and running, which it is. Very good. Next thing I wanna do is I want to demonstrate what we're going to actually do in this tutorial series. I want you to actually see the two different applications that we're gonna build in this tutorial series. I'm gonna go ahead and bring up Google Chrome. And the first one, I've got a very simple demonstration here, simple cube where we actually select a button and it actually scrolls to that portion of the cube, wherever I happen to have that title on the cube itself. And we're going to walk through and we're going to go through this step by step as to how we actually created this. It's not that difficult, especially now with the new CSS3 transformations. In the second demonstration, we're going to get a little trickier. Because what I want to do is I actually want to make a large cube, something that we may actually want to use on a website. And I'm actually going to give it titles, like this one is Action Script. It's actually going to use graphics and text as we scroll to these screens, similar to what we had done with the previous exercise, but this one's actually being put to use by using images and text inside those sections of the cube itself. And you'll notice you can see barely through here, I've got the transparency on. You can actually see the back of the cube, but I've actually left the text darker and actually the transparency not near as prevalent so that the text is easy to read on these front screens. And I'm going to show you how you can actually play with those different settings inside of CSS to get the exact type of presentation that you want by mixing graphics, text, and these animation effects inside your HTML documents. I think this is a very cool tutorial. Again, it's up until CSS3 we weren't able to do any of this. And these are the two that we're actually going to build in this demonstration. We're going to build, like I said, the small little cube, just giving you an idea of how the animations work. And then we're going to get into this bigger cube where we're actually going to put it to use and put some stuff in there that we may actually want to have on a website. All right, so I've got our start file loaded up inside my text editor. I'll be using Sublime Text 2 for this tutorial, and I'll be using Google Chrome as my web browser of choice. I'm going to go ahead and close out those two demonstrations that we had done and go back. I'm not quite certain why I closed out my web browser, but that's just because I'm losing my mind. And go back and go ahead and load up our start file. You can see now we've got our start file loaded, our 3D cube animation. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as our example 1. And again, I'm going to be inside that chapter folder for this cube. I'm going to be example1_1.html for this particular file. And now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and enter all the HTML code that we're going to use for our first demonstration. So again, I've got my doc type HTML with my head section, my character set. I'll go ahead and leave the style tags in there for now because we're going to be using those in a few minutes. I do want to add a viewport to this. I'm actually going to add a viewport scaling. We should start getting used to adding these viewport settings inside of the head section of our document because it is something that is a best practice for our viewport. And I'm basically setting this one up so that it disables zooming inside the viewport in the event someone's using a handheld device. Well, this is our 3D cube demonstration. So let's go ahead and change this title. We'll actually be doing two demonstrations of this 3D cube as I showed you in the demonstration of what we're actually going to be building. I'm going to go ahead and close that head section, get into the body section. The first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and put in an H1. So I'm going to add an H1 in here. And again, it's a best practice to have an H1 in every one of our HTML pages because it actually helps out with our SEO if we properly utilize our H1s, H2s, and H3s. They are a big part of SEO now. So this is one of our 3D cube demonstrations. I'm just going to put that title in there. And now what I want to do is I want to actually set up a section that's going to contain a container for our entire document. So I'm just going to go ahead and right underneath that H1, I'm going to put in a section tag with a classic container. And you actually could have used ID if you wanted to. And I'm going to go right down at the bottom of that, and I'm actually going to close that container section out. So now that we've got a container that's actually going to hold everything that's going to fall within inside our HTML body section, other than our H1. I'm going to leave the H1 outside the container, and I tend to do that a lot with my H1s. I actually leave them outside my containers. Next thing I want to do is I want to actually set up another div. And this one's actually going to be given an ID of cube. So I'm actually going to, right under my container div, I'm actually going to set up another div. It's going to be set up as a container div for cube. It's going to have an ID of cube and a class of show front. And you'll see how we use this in a few minutes. And then I'm actually just going to build inside here. I'm actually going to build the fronts to my cube. And you'll see that each one of these has a div. It's going to have its own class. It's going to have a paragraph tag. And then it's going to have a closing div. Let me go ahead and just put that whole thing in so it's indented correctly. So I've got one for my front. I'm going to do the same thing for my back. And once I get all this in, I'll go ahead and pause so you can catch up and type this in if you need to do that, which I'm sure you will, unless you have access to the exercise files. All right, so now I've got this front, I've got back. I'm getting ready to put in the right now. So I'm going to come down right below that back. I'm actually going to put in the right. And again, this is just the div for that right panel. Then I'm going to come right below that and put in the left panel. So I've got my front, my back, my right, my left. Now I'm going to do my top. I'm going to come down right below that and put in the top section. Let me go ahead and get that little space out of there. And we'll talk about these once we get everything in place. We're actually putting in the HTML markup for the sides of our cube. And that's why I've got them marked this way. I've got the front, the back, the right, the left, the top, and the last one I've got to put in here is the bottom. And then I'm going to close out that cube div that we set up at the very beginning. So I'm going to put in the bottom. And now what I need is I need a closing div tag for this actual class that we actually set up front where we had this cube. So I'm going to come right below that and I'm going to close out that div tag. And now that whole section that we've actually built up there, and I'm going to bring that section up, my container section up. I want to go ahead and save all those changes. I'm going to refresh my browser window. Let's go back and then load that example1.html. And you can just basically see what we've set up. I'm going to go ahead and scroll to the top. Good time to pause if you want to type that in. And then I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. In the event you didn't get the bottom section, good time to pause if you want to type that in. Because we still haven't gotten all of our HTML in yet. We're going to do the rest here in a second. Because now what I want to do is I want to set up my options section where we're actually going to have a section that contains my buttons. So I'm actually going to set up another section called options. And those are the buttons you saw in our demonstration where we could actually select what cube we wanted displayed. Let me go ahead and set all these up. Get my indenting correct so everything looks neat. Get my section correct. I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit. And now we've actually put the section in there which contains all the buttons that's going to allow us to move around in our cube. I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes, refresh the browser window. Now you can see our buttons across the bottom. And again, good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and scroll back up. Let's talk through what we put in here before we move on to the next section of the tutorial. So we've set up a standard HTML5 document. That's my doc type HTML. Inside my HTML sections, I've got my opening and closing tags like we do with all our HTML sections. And inside the head section of my document, I've actually set up Let me go ahead and indent this. I've actually set my meta character set to UTF-8. I've put in a meta name viewport, content initial scale 1.0, user selectable 0. And basically what that tells the browser is that zoom is disabled for this particular demonstration. I'm disabling the zoom feature in the event they have zoom capabilities on how they're viewing this. I've given ourselves a title for our page, 3D Cube demonstration. You can see that on our tab. I've opened and closed my style tags because again, we'll be styling the document internally, so it's going to be an embedded style sheet. It's not going to be external style sheet. Again, normal circumstances, we'd have this as an external style sheet because there's going to be quite a bit of styling that's involved with this particular document. Then I've come down, I've given myself my H1 heading for the page itself, 3D Cube demonstration, and I've set up the 6 sides of my actual cube. I've got them labeled with class names as front, back, right, left, top, bottom, and you'll notice each one's in its own div, so I can style them individually, and each div has a paragraph tag that allows me to put some text in there so it can be displayed inside of our browser window. And you can actually see the text now before we do any styling and how it's displayed in the browser window. Then right below that, I've actually closed out our section. That's our container section. Right below that, I've opened up a new section, and this is our options section. And this is where we're actually going to have the buttons displayed that allow us to make our selections. And keep in mind, if you remember back into one of the earlier tutorials, we talked about how these 3D spaces really need to have a containing element in order for the perspective and the perspective origin to be displayed correctly. And again, that's one of the reasons why I've set this up in its own container. We're just following the practices that we learned as we were learning all those new properties in CSS3. So as we continue, we're going to start styling this so we can actually start setting up those cubes to make our cube demonstration. All right, so let's go ahead and enter some styling now so we can actually start setting up our cube. I'm going to go ahead and do save as. Let's go ahead and save this as example_2.html. And the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead into our style tags at the very top, and let's go ahead and set up some generic styling for our body section for this particular demonstration. So I'm going to come right below our opening style tag, and I'm going to put in some styling for our body. I'll go ahead and discuss this as soon as I get it entered in. Let me go ahead and clean up the formatting. And what we've got here, okay, for my body element, I've actually set up a font family, Helvetica New, Arial, or Sans Serif. So I've given it 3 fonts that it has to use, to select from. I've given a text size adjust of none, which means, again, that's one of the reasons why up here we disable the zooming. I don't want my text sizes to adjust. And that has a lot to do with our cube, because we'd actually have to make the cube itself dynamic, and there is a lot involved with doing that. So in order to just avoid any problems that we'd have with people zooming in and out on the screen, we've just disabled zoom for this particular page, and we've told the text size adjust, set it to none. I've set it to font color size to a very dark gray. I've given my browser body width a max width of 720 pixels. I've set my margins at top and bottom at 0 and left and right auto, so this is going to center everything in our page. And I've put padding of 10 pixels around the entire body element. So now I'm going to go ahead and save the changes, refresh the browser window. Really shouldn't see anything new here. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that stuff in. The next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and set up our divs. You know, we've got a lot of divs that are part of this particular document. So I'm going to come right down below my body elements, and I'm actually going to put in some formatting for my div element. And all I'm doing is I'm taking out all the default margin settings that are part of our browser defaults for our divs. Since I did not use a CSS reset, I'm just going to go ahead and zero out all the margins. So I'm setting everything to 0 on the divs. Let's go ahead and, by the way, load example 2 so we can actually see these changes as they're taking place. That's why I didn't see the body changes. I forgot to load example 2. Whenever we save that as a new file, we have to go back to our Apache server and load that new file. So now you can actually see these changes are starting to take an impact. Next thing I want to do after the div, I want to actually start setting up our container. So I'm going to come in here, and right below my div element, where I set up the formatting for my div, I'm actually going to set up the formatting for my container. My container is going to have a width of 200 pixels. It's going to have a position of relative with a height of 200 pixels. It's going to have a margin, 0 on the top, auto on the left and right, 40 pixels on the bottom. I'm going to set up a perspective for this container. Remember, that's why we're using the container element, so we can keep our perspective and our perspective origin good with all our child elements. So I'm going to set that up as 1000 pixels. And again, remember, the containers was actually containing all of our div elements inside of our sections. Inside of our section, I mean, all these div elements are children of that container. And after that, we set up the container. Anyway, let me go ahead and scroll up a little bit. Good time for you to pause if you want to type that in. I'm going to go ahead and save all our changes and refresh the browser window. And now you can actually see where we're starting now to put together this container that's actually going to contain our cube. Let me go ahead and make this a little bit smaller so we can force it in a little bit. That's actually going to hold our cube. You can actually see the border now around that containing element. And the next thing I want to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and set up some formatting for our cube. I'm going to come right below the container. And again, I'm going to target my cube ID. Remember, we actually have a cube target right here. We've actually given a div an ID of cube, which contains all of our divs for our faces. I've given it a width of 100%, height of 100%, position is going to be absolute, so it's absolutely relative. It's absolute position in relationship to its container, and it's 100% of the container size, so its parent element, which is the container, and that's 200 by 200 pixels. I've given it a transform style of preserve 3D and a transition of transform 2 seconds. And what that is, that's actually how long it's going to take us to animate to those new faces, and I'll show you that as we get into this when we start playing with the actual cube itself, how we can adjust those times and those sizes, and exactly what we're doing here with this preserve 3D. That actually keeps our perspective correct as we rotate our cubes. I'm going to go ahead and save all these changes and refresh our browser window. And again, because we haven't done anything with our cubes yet, you're not going to see anything change in the window itself, but it's coming. Soon we'll be there. All right, so we're continuing to march. Let's go ahead and do save as. I want to save this as a new file name because we're actually adding a lot to it now. I want to keep this saved in increments. Okay, so right underneath our cube, I actually want to now target those div IDs that are inside our cube. Remember, we actually have divs inside this div that has an ID of cube. Well, now we're actually going to start we're actually going to start targeting those for some styling. And there's a couple things I have in here that, well, we'll talk about them when we get them in. First thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and do the cube and then get to the div itself. And the first thing you'll notice, I actually have a clear both on here. And you're probably wondering, well, wait a minute, where is that coming from? I want to leave that in because in the later exercise, we're actually going to add some images, and I'm going to actually do some floats with those images, and that's why I actually have this clear both in there. I just want to make certain that I don't forget to do it, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it in my styling. It doesn't hurt anything being there and not being used. I want this to be displayed as a block. I want it to be positioned absolutely, in other words, inside that element. I want it to be positioned absolutely inside there. Remember, we've got 200 by 200 is the size of the parent. So I'm actually making this div is going to be 196 by 196. And the reason being is because I have a 2 pixel border around it. So that's going to add 4 pixels to the width, which would give me 200, and 4 pixels to the height, which would give me 200. So because of that border, I'm actually going to make these 196 by 196. Let's go ahead and save those changes and refresh our browser window. And again, remember, we're targeting the divs inside our idea cube. I want to come down and now I actually want to target the paragraph that's inside that cube. So I'm actually going to come and grab that code, and then once we get this in and set up and formatted, I'll pause so you can get these typed in. And again, because I've got a large display of text, I'm going to go ahead and set my line height up to 78 pixels. You can play with this, by the way. You can play with these settings and make these anything that you want them to be. I just like them actually at this setting based on what I was doing. But it actually gives me a nice line height for the text itself. And again, I'm looking inside the idea cube with the child of div that has a direct child of P. So right now we're targeting right here. We're talking about those paragraph elements that are inside our div tags. So I've set up line height to 78, font size of 42 pixels, font weight of normal. I've given the font a color of white. You'll see why in a minute, because once we change our backgrounds, the white will stand out better once I start putting the faces on the cube itself. My text align is center, and my padding is 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 5 pixels, and 10 pixels. So 5 on the top, 5 on the right, 5 on the bottom, 10 on the left. And the reason I said a little bit more on the left here, and actually I'll make this 5 here. Once we put the image in, you'll actually want a little bit more spacing there. But we'll leave it for 5 for now. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. I'm going to go ahead and scroll up just a little bit. Good time to pause if you want to type those 2 sections in. Save our changes, refresh our browser window. And the next thing I want to do now is I want to go ahead and set up my panels, the back face. And yet we actually used this one earlier in one of our earlier tutorials, because I'm actually setting up my ID of cube, dot panels, backface, dot invisible, and then div. So basically I'm setting up the backface invisibility property. I'm just saying it is hidden. And it's based on how we've actually set up our panels. Go ahead and save all those changes. Good time to type this in if you need to catch up typing in. Let me go ahead and scroll down a little bit so we get it all in there. Because now next we're going to actually start moving into setting up the panels themselves for our cube. All right, so this next section now, this is going to get a little tedious. So I'm going to go slow because I want everybody to be able to keep up with me. But now we're actually going to start setting up the panels for our actual cube. And there's actually going to be 3 different lines of code that are going to be required for each panel. I'm going to group them together, but we're going to enter them. I'm going to enter all the fronts, then all the backs, but I'm going to leave spaces in between, and you'll see why as we do this, because I actually want them grouped into their own sections. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come right below where we just set up this panels, back face, invisible, and you probably wonder, where's it getting those names from? You're going to see now in a minute where we're getting that from. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to cube with a class of front. And you'll notice I'm giving it a background color. And it's a hue, saturation, luminescent alpha. And I'm setting them up as 0, 100%, 50%, and then 0.8 alpha. So it's going to get some transparency. And that's the first setting that we're putting in. Again, I'm coming to cube with a class of front. So I'm looking at this particular div section right here. We're actually beginning to set up the panel for that div section. So that's the first setting we need. Then I'm going to come down and I'm actually going to skip a few lines because I want these grouped together in different formats. And you'll see what I mean as we start entering the rest of these. I'm just going to go ahead and take out some of these spaces. Now I've got cube.front and now my transform, and you remember from the transform how we've done our translate Z. Remember that we're translating the Z at 100 pixels, and remember we're doing 100 pixels because it's 200 pixels width and height. So we want to be at the center, and that's why we're using 100 pixels translate Z. That actually puts us in the center. And we're going to play with this in a future part of this tutorial. You're going to see what that can do when we actually make the big cube, because there's some cool things you can do by playing with this setting. And then the next one I want to set up is I want to set up again, I'm still looking at this front. I'm going to come down a few lines, and now I'm looking at the cube.showFront, and you'll notice that we've got a class of showFront right there. And again, we're doing a transform translate Z. This is a minus 100 pixels. And it's only for this one particular, it's when we're on this home face, the standard face that's going to be the front face of our cube. So we're going to need sets of this for each one of our sides for our particular cube. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. I'm going to refresh the browser window. You shouldn't see anything happening yet, and you'll see why in a minute, because we actually have 2 more pieces of code that we have to put in here when we get all this done. Good time to pause if you want to type these in, because now I'm getting to do beginning to get ready to do the same thing for the back. So I'm going to come right here, and right below where we put up the HSLA for the front, I want to put the same thing for the back. Again, I'm assigning it an HSLA. This time I'm saying it's 60, 100, 50, and again, 0.08 for luminous, so we've got some transparency. I'm going to do the same thing for my cube back. just like we've done on the previous one. So I'm going to come down right below this, and I'm going to actually put in cube.back. And again, transform. This time I'm going to do the rotate X minus 180 degrees. Translate Z 100 pixels. And again, we already talked about why that's 100 pixels. And what we're doing now is we're starting to position these, because now we're going 180 degrees, which would be, if I'm opposite of my front, it's going to be minus 180 degrees to be in the back of the front. So that's where we're setting up the back, and then I'm going to do the same thing for the back. Right down here, now I have show back. Remember last time we did show front, now we're doing show back. Translate Z minus 100 pixels. Rotate X minus 180 degrees. Save all those changes. So now we've got two of our sides complete. We've got the front complete and the back complete. Good time to pause if you want to type those in. Because now I'm getting ready to do the same thing for the right. I'm not going to explain it like I have been, because I mean you should be catching on now, because now we're actually going to set up the 3 different parameters we need for the right. I come down right below where I did cube.back, and now I should do cube.right. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and take out some of these extra spaces that we have in here. Kind of clean this up a little bit. And I want to get the show right. Come down right below that, do my show right. Again, cleaning up my spaces. This one's minus 90 degrees. Because again, it's the right side of the cube. And that's what we're adjusting this, just like it was on a full circle. So now we're doing the right side. Good time to pause if you want to type those in. The next one I'm going to be doing is the left. So I'm going to come right at the top. This time we're going to do the left background. So we're setting up the background for the left. Then I'm setting up the translate for the left. Again, I'm just taking out extra spaces that we don't need. And then I'm going to do the show left. And go ahead and take those spaces out also. And again, we're actually setting up how these are going to be displayed now on our cube face. That's what we're doing. We're taking each side and setting up its background, its transform and rotate and translate, and then we're doing the translate Z and rotate Y for that particular piece. So we're setting up the backgrounds, the front, back, right, and left, and then the show, so they can all be seen. And now the next one I'm going to do is the top, because we haven't done the top and the bottom yet. We have a cube, front, back, left, and right, but we don't have a top and a bottom. Now we're getting ready to do our top. So we put the top in. And again, the only thing we're actually adjusting on this background, if you notice, is the HSL, the hue. We're actually changing the hue to give us different colors on each side. And by the way, that's what this is. This is huge saturation luminous. You can actually adjust these to get different colors, or if you wanted to, you could actually use RGBA if you wanted to. Instead of HSLA, you could change this to RGBA. The only thing you want to make certain of, you want to make certain that you have some transparency setting here at the end so you can kind of see into this cube. That's why I didn't use the hexadecimal values for colors, because I wanted the transparency. I can do that with either HSLA or RGBA. You can't do that with the hexadecimal values for the colors. Okay, now we got to go ahead and set up the top for our transform, just like we've done with our other settings. I'm just going to go ahead and pull out these extra spaces, just so it's nice and clean. And now I want to go ahead and put in the show top, and we're almost done. I have one more to do after we get this one, then we just got to do the bottom, and then we're good. Then we're golden. So now we've got the show top. By the way, we will not be able to see these when we're finished, and I'll explain why in a minute. Because of what we're going to do with this cube, there's actually some additional code we're going to have to put in here. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. And the last one I want to do is I want to do the bottom. So I'm going to go grab our bottom. I'm going to put in the background for the bottom itself to give us our color. Then I want to put in the bottom for the transform and translate. And the beauty is when we do this in the next one, for the next demonstration, we won't have to do all this again because a lot of this stays the same. So you've got the transform and rotate. Now let's go ahead and do our show bottom. And I'm hoping that by going through these exercises, you're actually learning about a lot of the different values and properties that are now available with CSS3. Because these are all the properties that we talked about in the early portions of this tutorial, where we went through and talked about each individual property. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and make sure you've got all of this typed in, because we've actually gotten to all these in. I'm going to go ahead and save all our changes. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my browser window. And you'll notice we're still not seeing anything. There's a couple more things we need to do in CSS. And then there's a couple things that we have to do inside of code. So let's go ahead and finish up our CSS while we're in this portion of the exercise, because I actually want to add a couple of things for our buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this and put this right below where we got this set up, because I actually want to do some formatting for our buttons themselves. I want to give them a width, and I want to get them centered on our stage. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes and refresh our browser window. Okay, that's looking pretty good there. And make sure that I've got my buttons ID, which I do. Good. That's inside my options. And I actually want to do one more. I'm actually going to put my clear in here, even though we're not using it for this particular demonstration. We will be for the next one. So I'm going to go ahead and put that clear in, where I actually clear my floats. I normally have that as a generic class anyway in most of my style sheets, because I tend to use it a lot. And it just clears floats. In the event I need them, I can actually just put in a div with a class of clear, and it clears all the floats that I need in the event that I have them. I'm going to go ahead and save all these changes. Let me go ahead and scroll down a little bit so you can get that typed in. Good time to pause if you need to type in the last portion we did. And in the next portion of the exercise, we're actually going to bring in some JavaScript now, because we actually have to do some JavaScript to get our cube to work correctly. This is open source JavaScript. One of them I've got is called the utility from Modernizer. And another one's just a utility that was written by MIT that allows me to actually scroll this cube. They are open source, they're available for download, and I will give you links to them when you do the tutorial. All right, so we've got all our changes entered. Let's go ahead and go back and refresh our browser window. Let's go ahead and load up 3 so you can see what's going on now. We actually do have our buttons centered now. We've got our different faces and fronts put onto our cube itself. So the cube's actually starting to take shape, but you'll notice nothing is working. And the reason being is we actually need a little bit of JavaScript. I'm going to use what's called Modernizer, and there's actually a little utility that I wrote, actually that I modified, called the rotate.js, that's actually going to rotate this cube for us. Both of those files will be available for download. I do want to point out that the Modernizer is an open source license, and it's available by CC BY, Creative Commons organization licenses. I do need to mention that because it is an open source license. We can use it. It's free to use and use inside these tutorials, but again, we have to mention that it is part of an open source license for Modernizer. And also, some of the example code that we're using was written by Paul DeSandro from MIT. And again, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, again, he's available. We can use it all we want. We can make all the modifications we want to it, but it's only right to mention that he actually did write the original code for this. So again, Paul DeSandro from MIT was actually the source of where I got some of the stuff that we're doing for this particular demonstration. All right, so let's go in and actually go now. I'll show you where we're going to get those files, and we'll put those in, and our cube will be working for the first portion of our demonstration. All right, so I'm going to be linking to 2 files that are part of my directory structure. If you'll notice inside my web root directory, I've got our example files in our start folder, and I also have a JS file in here, JS folder, that contains two folders, one called rotate.js and the other called utility.js. Utility is actually the modernizer utility that I was talking about a few moments ago, and rotate's the actual JavaScript that I've written to actually rotate our cube. Utility is part of Modernizer, and it's also got some of the code that Cassandra actually modified from MIT in Modernizer for this cube to rotate in the way that it does. So I'm going to go ahead and link to these two files again. You'll be able to download these files if you haven't purchased the tutorial and have access to all the exercise files. They'll be part of the exercise folder. If not, there'll be a link where you can actually download these if you're doing this from the website. So you can download these two files. If you have any problems, don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm going to add two links into our HTML document. First, I want to do save as. Let's go ahead and save this as example number 4. .html. I'm going to go back and refresh my browser window and actually load up example number 4. So we've got it loaded in our screen. And now I want to go to the bottom of our actual HTML document. I'm going to go ahead and grab two links. That's going to link to those script files that I just showed you. So I'm going to come down right down below my HTML, and I'm going to put in two script tags. And I actually have to put the directories here because I didn't notice I did not do that. They're actually in a JS directory. So I just want to add that to this, or else they will not link correctly. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to refresh my browser window. You shouldn't notice any difference until we actually click on a button, because now you'll actually notice that our cube now rotates based on what we've selected. So we've actually finished the first portion of this exercise, and when we do the next demonstration, you're actually going to get into a lot of the things that we've done in here and how and why I've set these up the way we have, and you're going to see how we can make adjustments to the cube, not only so it holds additional information, but actually we can make it bigger, we can make it smaller, we can change the luminance. I mean, there's a whole lot of things we can do to this. And this actually gives you a lot of opportunities to do things on your website, because now you have 6 times the space in this one square. Just by putting these buttons in here, I can have 6 times the information here and let the user select what I want them to see. Plus, it's very interactive, and it's very cool to see that this is done with a little bit of JavaScript. In fact, let me show you what I've got for the JavaScript. For our actual rotate function itself, it's not really that bad. The rotate function itself is actually quite small. But it actually goes in and looks at that JavaScript. Let me put on my word wrap so you can see everything. This is all we're doing now to actually make this rotate. We're using Modernizer so all our different browsers recognize it. But I mean, it's pretty cool what we're doing here. And you'll notice I can get it caught in between. And it just does what it needs to do. It's really kind of cool. I like it. It's a very cool little demonstration. So in the next portion of this, we're actually going to make this larger, and we're actually going to add some graphics and text inside these elements, so you can actually see a lot more about what's going on inside this cube and how we can actually use these for some productive stuff on our websites. All right, so let's keep moving right along. I want to go ahead and make some changes now. Let me show you how we can make changes to this particular tutorial and actually make this cube a lot more useful. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. I'm going to save this as example_5.html. And now we're going to go and load example 5 into our browser window, because now what I want to do is I want to make some changes to this. The first thing we're going to do is let's go up to our container element itself, and I want to change the width and the height. I want to make the container element 400 pixels wide by 400 pixels high. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Then I want to go into our cube, and where I have my transition transform 2 seconds, I want to go ahead and make that 1 second, because I noticed that it was transforming a little bit slow when we were doing the demonstration. Let's go ahead and make that 1 second. Refresh the browser, and you can actually see already the difference we're having with our cube. And you can actually see something, and I actually did this on purpose. I wanted to do this demo on purpose. You can see now that we're getting a whole lot of different effects based on our perspective and the size that we've made the container, because we really haven't adjusted the cube itself yet. So we've actually just made a couple small adjustments, and you can see that we're rotating inside of our container, but it's not rotating the way it was done or was being done before. So that's kind of cool. Now what I want to do is I want to actually go ahead and change I'm going to come right down below where we did our last adjustment to the cube, and I actually want to add a section because we're actually going to add some images to this. So I'm going to add a section called cube, and then image, because we're actually going to have an image tag inside of our cube elements. Open and closing curly braces. Now I want to go ahead and grab some styling for this cube, for this image I should say. And I'm going to set them up as display inline. I'm going to give them a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels. I want them to float left, and I'm going to give them 10 pixels of padding around the image itself. Let's go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to go ahead and scroll up a little bit. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in, because that's a section we didn't have in our previous demonstration. We're actually now going to set up an area for an image inside of our cube itself. Now I want to go down and make a couple changes to our div tags that are inside of our cube, and I just want to adjust their width and height from 196 to 396. And again, it's 396 because don't forget we have this 2 pixels of padding all the way around. So if I have 4 pixels right and left, that's going to make this 400. 4 pixels top and bottom, it's going to make that 400. So I'll have 400 by 400 with when I count my borders. And that's going to match what we've set up here inside of our container element. And that's why I've actually done it that way. So let's go ahead and save all those changes. Good time to pause if you need to type those in. I'm going to refresh the browser window. And now you'll notice we've actually got our cube set up again. And it looks like it's the right size. One thing I want you to notice that I thought was kind of cool as I was playing with these, because our translate is set to 100 pixels, it's actually giving us a very unique effect here. If you kind of look when it rotates, in fact, let me slow it down a little bit. I'm going to go back and set this back. Let's set this to 3 seconds, just for a couple of seconds here so you can see what I'm talking about. Refresh the browser window. As this rotates now, you can actually see how the translate's actually cutting this up, which I thought was very cool. You can actually see the translate because it's thinking it's 100 by 100, so it's sitting in here for the center. But because we haven't actually adjusted these yet, so it actually makes it appear like our cube is 4 pieces of cardboard that are kind of stuffed together. We've actually seen these kind of dividers inside boxes. And it actually looks kind of cool. It gives you a cool effect as to what's happening inside of our cube itself. We're going to fix it obviously when we change the rest of our settings, but I just thought it was kind of cool. Let's go ahead and put this back to 1 second. Because I mean, you may actually want an effect like that when you're doing something someday. Who knows? So if you do, you know how that translate property works. You can now change the translate. We're getting ready to fix that though in a few minutes. I want to come down here now. Let's go back to our cube div where we have our paragraph tag, and I want to change quite a few settings here. I want to change our line height to 20 pixels because we're actually going to have some significant text in here. I want to go ahead and change my font size to 18 pixels. And again, you can make these any size you need for your particular demonstration. I want to change my font color to black. And again, that's because we're going to actually change the opacity. We're actually going to make these a little bit darker. I want to change my text align to justify. And I actually want to go back and put my 10 pixels here because when I put the graphic in, when I put my image in, I'm going to need that little spacing on the left. It'll give us a little additional spacing. Let's go ahead and save all those changes, refresh our browser, and now you can see we're actually getting some changes occurring inside of our document. We're going to go and finish up our styling right now. Let's go ahead and just keep on driving. All right, I want to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as example number 6. And again, I like saving these in SEP, so if you have access to the exercise folder, you have all of these. I'm going to go ahead and refresh that, and let's reload example number 6 because we've still got some changes to make. I want to come down here. The first thing I want to do is I want to change my opacity. Since I'm going to have a lot of text and graphics in here, I want to make this 0.9. This is going to make these a little more opaque, so we're not going to have as much transparency as we had last time. And again, it's good that we're doing this because I want you to see how we make all these settings occur when we actually set these up. The more you understand all the stuff that we're changing, the easier it's going to be for you to actually set up your own. And you'll notice when I refresh that window, we're not quite seeing through this as well as we were before. By making that a 0.9, it's almost fully opaque. Still get a little bit of transparency, but not a lot. And the reason I did that is again because we're going to have some text on there. Now I want to come down. Let's go ahead and fix this translate. And when we do is we make this 200, because remember, actual size is 400. So we're actually cutting these in half. And this is going to take those lines that we see appearing right here that are actually cutting our box. It looks like we've got some kind of packing material in there. It's actually going to clean all that up now and give us our nice clean sides again. So let's go ahead and save all those changes, refresh our browser window, and you'll see now we've got those nice clean sides and a much bigger cube. So don't forget, we've taken all the translates and we've put those to 200 pixels. Good time to pause if you need to type that stuff in. Don't forget to change your alpha settings on your backgrounds. And now what I want to do is I want to come down and scroll down. I actually want to change this to 500 where we have our button set up, because right now we're kind of over to the left a little bit. I'm going to change it to 500 so we get a little bit better centering of our buttons inside there. Do a save all, refresh, and there we get a little bit better centering inside of there, and our cube seems to be working really well. So the next thing we need to do now, we need to actually go in and set up the paragraph tags that are actually holding this information. What I do want you to realize, I actually have a directory inside my web root where these documents are residing, and I have an images folder in here, and this is where I'm going to pull these images from that are actually going to put the images inside of our cube. Again, if you have access to the exercise files, you will have these images. If not, you can use whatever images you want. I've got them sized, I believe, up here at 100 by 100. And I thought that was a good size based on the size of our cube. You can actually use whatever images you want. Now what I want to do is I'm going to actually go into our divs that actually make up our sides. And I'm actually going to change, in fact, let's put some spacing in here so you can see what we're doing. I'm actually going to take everything that's part of this front div and I'm going to replace it. I'm still going to have my front class, but now I've actually put an image holder in here. I've got another div in here which actually has my clear for clearing my floats. And I've got some paragraph text. So I've added an image, then I've put in a clear div to clear the float because I actually have this image floating left, if you remember right from our style sheet, where we actually set up that image. I've got it floating left right there. And because I didn't want that to impact my paragraph, I'm actually clearing out that float before I get to the paragraph text so that it will flow around my image. So I'm going to go ahead and save those changes, refresh my browser window, and now you can see exactly what I've done to my cube. I actually have this lorem ipsum text. I have a nice little image in the top, and it is going to become part of that cube face. So as I'm scrolling through here, I'll actually have some good information in this cube, stuff that my users could use inside this site. I'm going to go ahead and grab my back and do the same thing. So I'm going to grab the elements for my back. I'm actually going to give them a new set of elements. They're going to have an image tag also, my paragraph text, and my closing div. Let me go ahead and scroll up to that top one. In the event you don't have access to the exercise file, it's a good time to pause if you want to type all that in. And again, I'm just using lorem ipsum filler text. The key here is to get the images path. Remember, I've got that images folder with the images inside of it. I've set my width at 100 by 100. You can play with these any size you want based on what you're building with your cube. And then I'm using this clear div to clear the float so that my text flows around that image. Same thing here. By the way, you don't have to float these left. You could float them right. You can intermix them. You could actually set up different types of images, some on the right, some on the left, some in the center. I'm going to do the same thing with my right now. Basically duplicating what we've done. The only thing I've really changed on these paragraphs is the images themselves. The lorem ipsum text is pretty standard. I'm just basically changing the paragraph. Or the image itself, I mean. The paragraph text is lorem ipsum. I'm just basically changing the image. I'm going to go ahead and do the left. Clean up my text. Save those changes. Again, good time to pause if you want to do that right and left section. And now I've got two left. I've got to go ahead and do my top and bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the top and bottom and put those in. And again, I did this basically so you could see some of the things that we could do with these. There's a lot of cool stuff we could do with this. I mean, I could think of a lot of things I could actually do with these cubes. You could have photographs with text. You could actually make like a photo cube. I don't know if any of you remember in the old days when some of us were young, we used to have photo cubes on our desk. And it was the in thing in the early 80s to have a photo cube on your desk with 6 pictures of your family in it. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Again, good time to pause if you want to type in the top and bottom. But our cube now should be complete. We actually should have a completed cube. All of our stuff should be on all 6 sides. Oh, I do notice I've got something going on here. I don't know if it's something that I did in one of my cubes. I might have missed an element. Let me go make sure I've got my opening and closing tags. I didn't miss any of my closing divs because that will definitely goof us up. It doesn't look like it's a back. It looks like it might be a bottom. That's goofed up. Let's see, you got that? Actually, let me rotate it and see. It does actually look like it's a bottom. So that probably means I've got something that's, because I didn't notice it before, but it could be because I wasn't paying attention up top. Yep, that's all it was. Didn't have a tag closed on the bottom, which is what I thought. That's why the bottom was the one that was sticking out. Looks good now. Now the last thing we have to do is just have to change the way we've got the buttons labeled so that we actually have them labeled the way that they're going. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that and change my button labels. I could have actually just typed it all in, but I don't think you want to watch me. This has been a relatively long tutorial. A little bit longer than I wanted it to go, but I still think it's kind of cool what we've covered, because we've covered a lot of stuff now on how to use these cubes, how you can actually benefit from using these cubes on your site. So I'm kind of hoping it was worthwhile for you. I know it was for me. I learned a ton of stuff going through all the specs on the transform in CSS3. Thought it was very cool. I'm going to go ahead and save these changes to our button. I'm going to refresh the browser window, and now we have our buttons relabeled. The one thing I do want to do, though, I want to take out that I put 500 pixels on that button, and it's just not looking right. I'm going to take it back to 400. Do a save all, refresh. That should center it a little better, which it did. We can go to PHP, HTML5, and you can tell that by the actual graphic that's in the corner. HTML, CSS, CSS3, and ActionScript. So now we're actually using the 6 sides of that cube to actually do something worthwhile on the site. And again, changing the translate Z helped us impact the size, but the big thing here was changing the actual opacity. If I wanted these to be solid, I could actually just make this a 1.0, or just 1 itself, because that is solid. It's 0.021. You can tell now that's actually a solid cube. The other ones are a little bit transparent. If you wanted it more opaque, you could actually just put down 0.8, 0.7, 0.6. Actually, if you put 0.5, 0.5, that would be very opaque. And with all the text on there, it's probably going to be hard to read. Because, again, we have all this text on there, but what's kind of cool is you can actually see the images in the background as these things rotate through. You can actually see that image in the background for all the different ones. There's one up in the corner, here's one, there's the CSS3 one down there in the bottom. So again, kind of cool using these cubes and the 3-dimensional transforms inside of CSS3. I'm going to do another one. I think another good demonstration would be how we could build a carousel using CSS3. And that's going to be, and I think I'll probably use those same JavaScript apps that I was using for this demonstration, because again, they make the movement a lot easier. I don't have to do a lot of things like we did with the card flip by working on click activities. We can actually just use these buttons and stuff. And I kind of like the way this is working. It kind of works kind of cool. So we will, in the next tutorial, I think we're going to go after a carousel effect. I look forward to seeing you in that tutorial.